The last of the autumn roses had been cut and arranged in the blue parlor when the letter arrived. Elinor did not break the seal immediately. She let it rest on the silver salver while she finished instructing the housekeeper on the linen inventory, her voice even, her hands perfectly still. That was the way of it now, every small task performed with precision, because precision was the only armor that had not been stripped from her. Her husband had been gone for the entirety of the London season, and everyone in England knew precisely where he was. Alexander Devereux, the sixth Duke of Ashworth, had installed his latest mistress, an actress of French extraction with a throaty laugh and no discernible surname, in a townhouse on Half Moon Street. The scandal sheets had christened her La Duval, and they chronicled his devotion with the same breathless attention they once reserved for royal processions. Elinor had stopped reading the columns in June, not because they pained her, but because they had become absurdly repetitive. A man could parade his infidelity only so many times before it curdled from insult into farce. She broke the seal of the letter at last and found inside a heavy card of cream stock, embossed with a raven in flight and the initials R. The Duke of Ravenscroft requests the pleasure of the Duchess of Ashworth's company at dinner this evening. Carriage will be sent at 7 o'clock. There was no apology for the lateness of the invitation, no flowery preamble. Dominic Hale, the Duke of Ravenscroft, did not offer explanations. He commanded the largest private fortune in England, held sway over half the Lords' votes, and had buried 3 prime ministers' careers without once raising his voice in public. He never hosted dinners. He never called upon anyone. Society whispered that he found the entire human race a tedious distraction from his own thoughts. That he had invited Elinor, and Elinor alone, was a statement that would ripple through the county before breakfast. She considered refusing. A duchess, even a publicly abandoned one, did not dine unchaperoned with an unmarried peer. Then she thought of the empty chair at the foot of her own table, the cold sheets in the master's chambers, the absolute quiet of a house that had forgotten the sound of a man's boots crossing the threshold. She thought of Alexander laughing in his opera box while Celeste Duval leaned against his shoulder. "I shall need the bronze silk," she told her maid, "and the pearl combs." Ravenscroft Hall was a monument to controlled darkness. Every corridor was lined with oak paneling so deep in color it seemed to drink the candlelight. Footmen moved without sound. There were no flowers, no frivolous ornamentation, only the occasional flash of a Dutch master's painting or a globe of celestial charts. It was a house that did not need to impress, because it had been impressing the world for 3 centuries and had grown bored of the effort. The butler led Elinor to a small dining room, intimate by ducal standards, where a round table had been set for 2. A fire crackled in the grate, and rising from his chair, one hand resting lightly on the carved arm, was the Duke of Ravenscroft. He was not a handsome man in the fashionable sense. His features were too severe, his brow too heavy, his eyes the color of weathered flint. But the sum of him was arresting, a presence that stilled the air. He looked at Elinor as though he had been expecting her for a very long time and saw no reason to feign surprise. "Your Grace," she curtsied, and the title tasted strange on her tongue, as though she were addressing a title that had been hollowed out. "Duchess," he gestured to the opposite chair, "I am grateful you accepted. My invitations are rarely answered with anything but alarm." "I am no longer a woman who can afford to be alarmed by society's opinions," she said, sitting. "Those opinions have already been formed." A faint movement at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, something quieter. "Then we shall have a very honest meal." The soup course was halfway finished when the outer doors crashed open. There was no announcement, no measured tread of the butler. Only the storm of footsteps and a voice that had once made Elinor's pulse quicken, but now landed on her ears like the crack of a whip. "Where is my wife?" Ashworth burst into the dining room, his cravat loosened from the ride, his dark hair wind-torn. He had ridden hard from London, that much was clear. The dust of the road still clung to his coat. His eyes swept the scene. The intimate table, the firelight, his wife seated opposite the most powerful duke in the land, and a flush of possessive rage rose up his throat. Ravenscroft did not stand. He set down his spoon with a precise click and regarded Ashworth as one might regard a horse that had wandered into a church. "Your Grace," Ravenscroft said, his tone completely neutral, "you were not expected." Clearly, Ashworth's gaze snapped to Eleanor. "I returned to Ashworth Hall an hour ago to find my house empty and my wife dining without a chaperone in the home of a man whose reputation is a shadow over every woman he acknowledges. You will come with me now." Eleanor lifted her glass of claret and took a measured sip. She did not rise. She did not flush. She looked at her husband, the man who had left her in the country while he spent an entire season with an actress on his arm, and found that the part of her that might once have wept was now entirely silent. "Good evening, Alexander," she said. "Was the journey from London tiring, or did Celeste see you off with sufficient affection?" The silence that followed was the first honest silence of their marriage. Ashworth's hand clenched at his side. The question had landed like a blade slipped between ribs, so cleanly that he did not realize he was wounded until he tried to draw breath for a retort and found none. Eleanor watched him, her expression serene, and he understood in that excruciating moment that the woman sitting before him was not the girl he had married 6 years ago. That girl had looked at him with hesitant hope, ready to forgive his coldness if only he would offer a scrap of warmth. This woman was forged of something far less breakable. "You will not speak of her," he managed. "Not here." "Why ever not?" Eleanor's tone was conversational. "She has been spoken of everywhere else. The clubs, the papers, the modistes' salons. I merely inquire after her well-being as any considerate wife might." Ravenscroft remained motionless, a spectator to a duel he had not initiated but had no intention of halting. His presence was the great unspoken variable in the room. Ashworth could not decide whether to challenge him or ignore him, and that indecision stripped away another layer of authority. Ashworth stepped closer to the table. "Eleanor, you will return to Ashworth Hall. Tonight, I will not have my wife become the subject of scurrilous gossip." "I became the subject of scurrilous gossip the moment you installed an actress in Half Moon Street," Eleanor said. "Your concern for my reputation arrives several months too late. I suggest you write to the scandal sheets and inform them of your belated epiphany. I am certain they will be fascinated." The Duke of Ravenscroft lifted a hand, a minimal gesture, and a footman materialized from the shadows to refill Eleanor's glass. "Ashworth," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had never needed to repeat himself, "you are in my home. You have interrupted a private dinner. I will overlook the breach of decorum if you withdraw now and send a proper card in the morning." "I am not leaving without my wife." "Then you will be standing there for a considerable time," Eleanor said. She turned to Ravenscroft. "Your Grace, earlier you mentioned the Capability Brown drawings in your library. Might we continue our conversation there? I find the atmosphere in this room has soured." Ravenscroft rose. He was taller than Ashworth by several inches, and when he moved, the candlelight seemed to reorganize itself around him. "Of course, the library is at your disposal, for as long as you require." Ashworth's voice cracked. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" She stood, the bronze silk rustling like autumn leaves, and faced her husband squarely. "I am accepting the hospitality of a gentleman who does not expect me to be grateful for his neglect. You wish to spend a season with your mistress, Alexander. Very well. I have decided to spend a week with a man who finds my conversation sufficiently interesting to request my company at dinner. Fair exchange." "There is nothing fair about this." "There never was." She smoothed the folds of her gown. "That, I think, is the point." She walked past him, her shoulder not quite brushing his arm, and Ravenscroft offered her his escort. At the threshold of the dining room, she paused but did not turn. The housekeeper at Ashworth Hall has instructions to prepare the green guest chamber for you. It overlooks the stables. I hope you find it comfortable." Then she was gone, the echo of her heels dissolving into the hush of the corridor, and Ashworth was left alone with the cooling soup and the dying fire and the terrible, dawning realization that he had mistaken his wife's patience for permanence. That night, Elinor sat in a leather armchair in Ravenscroft's library while the Duke himself poured 2 measures of brandy. The room smelled of old paper and wood smoke and something faintly metallic, like a storm on the verge of breaking. She accepted the glass and did not pretend to be scandalized by the impropriety. Impropriety had long since lost its power to frighten her. "You handled him very cleanly," Ravenscroft observed, taking the chair opposite. "I expected tears or recriminations. You offered neither." "I have already wept all the tears that marriage produced," she said. "There are none left for public display." He studied her with that disconcerting stillness. "Why did you stay with him? Before the actress, I mean." Elinor turned the glass in her hands. "Because I believed vows mattered, because I was raised to endure, because a duchess who leaves her duke is a scandal, and a scandalized woman loses everything, her position, her children, her very name. I was too dutiful to risk it. And now—" She met his eyes. "Now I have realized I have already lost everything that mattered. There is nothing left to risk." Ravenscroft nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed a theory he had been testing for years. "Then I shall be very clear about why I invited you here. It was not charity. It was not pity. It was not, as your husband will certainly claim, a scheme of seduction." He paused. "I invited you because I have watched you navigate a season of humiliation with more composure than any statesman I have ever known. I find composure to be the most underrated virtue in England." Elinor felt something shift in her chest, not hope, not yet, but the recognition that hope might one day be possible. "What do you want from me, your grace?" "Nothing you are not prepared to offer freely." He raised his glass. "A week of conversation, a demonstration to the ton that the Duchess of Ashworth is not a woman to be discarded. Whatever follows will follow." She considered the proposal, the careful absence of pressure, the respect embedded in every syllable. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches of the chestnut trees, and somewhere in the dark, her husband was riding back to an empty house, to a cold bed, to the first night of a reckoning he had never believed would arrive. "1 week," she said, "and then we shall see what remains of my reputation." Ravenscroft inclined his head. "I suspect it will be more than you imagine." The week became a fortnight, and the fortnight became the single most discussed event of the autumn. Elinor remained at Ravenscroft Hall, and the Duke of Ravenscroft, who had never hosted a hunt, a ball, or a supper party in living memory, escorted her on drives through the countryside, attended a local assembly with her on his arm, and was seen in earnest discussion with her over teacups in the conservatory. Society was aghast, titillated, and deeply confused. Ashworth, meanwhile, had become a ghost in his own estate. He wandered the corridors of Ashworth Hall, room after room that smelled of lavender and emptiness, and replayed the dinner scene in his mind until it became a private theater of humiliation. He wrote to Elinor 3 times. The first letter was imperious, demanding her return. The second was wounded, accusing Ravenscroft of manipulation. The third was a single line: "What must I do?" Elinor's reply to the third letter arrived on a silver tray, written on Ravenscroft's stationery, because she had not brought her own. "You must understand what you have done. Until then, there is nothing to discuss." The memories came for Ashworth in the small hours. He remembered their wedding day, Elinor in ivory lace, her hand trembling as he slipped the ring onto her finger. He had been distracted, already bored by the ceremony, already thinking of the mistress he had not quite given up. He remembered the months that followed, her attempts to please him, the dinners she arranged with his favorite dishes, the way she learned the names of all his tenants before he could be bothered to recall half of them. He remembered the night she had dressed in a gown of deep green velvet, her hair arranged in the style he had once admired on a visiting soprano, and he had glanced at her and said, "That color does not suit you," before leaving for his club. He had not been deliberately cruel, he told himself. He had simply been indifferent, and indifference, he was beginning to understand, was a slower poison than malice. One afternoon, in a fit of desperate clarity, he rode to the village and purchased a bracelet, emeralds, her birthstone, because he remembered that much at least. He sent it to Ravenscroft Hall with a note, "For Eleanor, I am trying." The bracelet was returned an hour later, wrapped in the same velvet box, unopened. The messenger reported that her Grace had not even paused her game of chess with the Duke of Ravenscroft to inspect it. Ravenscroft, for his part, was proving to be an education in what a man could be. He did not flatter Eleanor, he challenged her. They debated enclosure acts over breakfast and crop rotation over dinner. He asked her opinion on estate management, her opinion as though it mattered, and when she offered a suggestion about drainage in the lower fields, he wrote to his steward that afternoon to implement it. She discovered that he read philosophy in 4 languages and could identify birdsong without looking up from his correspondence. He was, in every measurable sense, the most formidable man she had ever met. And yet he never once made her feel small. One evening, walking the lamplit path along the ornamental lake, she asked him why he had never married. He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. "I was engaged once," he said at last. "She died of a fever 2 weeks before the wedding. After that, I found that the noise of society did not interest me. I retreated into my work and my solitude and told myself I preferred it." "And did you?" "I believed I did." He looked at her, and the flint gray of his eyes had softened to the color of winter sky. "Until I watched a woman endure public betrayal with the grace of a queen and realized that solitude was merely the absence of the right companion." Eleanor's breath caught. She did not speak. She did not need to. From that moment, the question was no longer whether she would leave Ashworth, but how, and what she would walk toward when she did. The carriage meeting was arranged through intermediaries. A neutral location, the private parlor of an inn on the Great North Road, halfway between the 2 estates. Eleanor arrived with her maid and a leather portfolio containing documents prepared by a London solicitor recommended by Ravenscroft. She wore a traveling dress of sober gray, her hair pinned tightly beneath a bonnet that framed her face like a portrait of quiet resolve. Ashworth was already there, packing. He had lost weight. The arrogance in his bearing had been replaced by a jittery tension, a man who had spent weeks staring into an abyss of his own making and had not liked what he saw there. "Eleanor." He moved toward her and she stepped back, a small, precise movement that stopped him as surely as a wall. "Please, sit down. Let us speak as we have not spoken in years." She sat, but she did not remove her gloves and she did not return his tentative smile. "I have prepared terms," she said, sliding a document across the table. "I will retain my dowry in its entirety. I will establish a separate residence. Ravenscroft has offered the use of a property on the edge of his estate, but I will pay rent from my own income so that there is no obligation. We will draw up a deed of separation, legally binding. You will not contest it." Ashworth stared at the paper as though it were written in a foreign tongue. "A separation. You want a separation." "I want my freedom. The legal title of Duchess may remain with me, since the law does not permit divorce on these grounds. I will not remarry while you live, that much I concede. But I will not share your roof, your table, or your bed again." "Eleanor, this is madness." He dropped into the chair opposite her, his composure crumbling. "I know I have wronged you. I know I have been the worst sort of husband, but ending a marriage, think of what it will mean. The scandal." "The scandal is already written," she said. "I am merely choosing how it ends." He looked at her then, truly looked, and what he saw seemed to unman him more than her words. Her calm was absolute. There was no anger trembling beneath the surface, no hope that he might argue her back into his arms. She was not performing indifference. She had become it. "I love you," he said, and the words fell out of him like stones dropped into a well, clattering against the walls before vanishing into the dark. "I did not know it until I saw you in that room with him. But I do. I love you, and I have wasted 6 years not showing it, and I will spend the rest of my life making amends if you will only give me the chance." Alina folded her hands. "I believe you believe that, Alexander, but you are in love with the idea of losing me, not with the woman you neglected for half a decade. If I returned today, in a month you would be restless. In a year there would be another actress. It is your pattern." "It is not." "It is. Your father's pattern, too, from what I understand. And his father." She met his gaze without cruelty but without mercy. "I do not wish to be a pattern, Alexander. I wish to be a person." He buried his face in his hands, and for a long while there was only the crackle of the fire and the distant rumble of a cart passing on the road outside. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed. "What can I do to prove you wrong?" Alina considered him. The part of her that had once loved him, the young woman who had embroidered his initials on handkerchiefs and waited up for his carriage, stirred faintly, like a sleeper turning in a dream. But it did not wake. "I will not promise you a reconciliation," she said. "But if you wish to prove that you are capable of honor, you may begin by ending your association with Celeste Duval openly, and without expectation of reward. Then you may conduct yourself in society as a man who respects his wife, whether or not she ever returns to his house. If you can do these things without my prompting and without my gratitude, then perhaps you will have become the man you claim to be." She stood. "I will be at Lady Hartwell's ball in 3 weeks' time. If you have made a beginning, I will acknowledge it. That is all I can offer." She left the documents on the table and walked out to the waiting carriage, where the Duke of Ravenscroft's crest gleamed on the door panel. Ashworth watched her go, the paper of the separation agreement crisp beneath his fingers, and felt the full weight of a lifetime's careless choices settle onto his shoulders. Lady Hartwell's ball was the first major event of the winter season, and by 9 o'clock the rooms were a crush of silk, jewels, and barely veiled curiosity. Word had spread through the ton like fire through dry grass. The Duchess of Ashworth would attend, and she would not be on her husband's arm. The Duke of Ravenscroft would escort her. Even the most jaded dowagers positioned themselves near the entrance to witness the spectacle. Alina arrived in deep sapphire velvet, a gown cut with elegant simplicity that made the over-adorned confections of the other ladies look foolish. Her only jewelry was a pair of sapphire drops that had belonged to Ravenscroft's mother, lent for the occasion, a detail that did not escape the sharp-eyed matrons. Ravenscroft walked beside her, his expression unreadable, his posture radiating a power that made people instinctively step back. They had been in the ballroom for perhaps 20 minutes when Ashworth arrived. He came alone, no Celeste Duval clinging to his sleeve, no rakish companions laughing at some whispered jest. He was immaculately dressed in dark blue superfine, his hair trimmed with uncharacteristic restraint, and his expression was that of a man walking into a courtroom to hear his own sentence. He scanned the crowd until his eyes found Alina, and then he crossed the room. The buzz of conversation dipped. "Your Grace," he bowed to Alina with a formality that bordered on ceremonial. "You look very well this evening." "Thank you," Alina said, her voice betraying nothing. "I trust you are well." "I am well enough." He turned to Ravenscroft and, after a visible hesitation, offered a bow of precisely correct depth. "Ravenscroft." "Ashworth." The pleasantries hung in the air. Then Ashworth did something that caused the nearest bystanders to draw audible breaths. He extended his hand to his wife. "If you are not otherwise engaged, I would be honored to claim the first waltz, as your husband." It was a public statement. The waltz was the most intimate of the approved dances, and a husband leading his wife into it was a declaration of unity. To offer it after months of separation, in full view of the ton, was either a profound act of contrition or an astonishing piece of theater. Elinor studied him for a long moment, then she placed her hand in his. "I am not otherwise engaged." Ravenscroft released her with the barest inclination of his head, and Elinor allowed Ashworth to lead her to the floor. The musicians, attuned to the electric shift in the room, struck up a waltz as though they had been waiting for this precise cue. They danced. Ashworth's hand at her waist was correct but not presumptuous. His steps were steady. He did not look at anyone else in the room. "I ended it," he said quietly so that only she could hear. "Publicly. I gave her a settlement and a letter of reference, and I told her I would not see her again. She is already on a packet to Calais." "I heard." Elinor's tone was neutral. "The scandal sheets were full of it. They said you wept at the docks." "I did not weep." A pause. "I did stand there a long while after the ship sailed, not for her, for the man I had been." They turned, and the chandeliers blurred overhead. Elinor could feel the eyes of the ton on them, hundreds of speculative gazes weighing the meaning of this reconciliation tableau. She did not care about any of them. She cared about the tremor in her husband's voice, the unfamiliar humility that sat awkwardly on him like a borrowed coat. "I have been thinking," Ashworth said, "about the night you mentioned, the opera." Elinor's composure flickered. "That was not a memory I expected you to recall." "I recall all of it now. You had asked me weeks before if you might accompany me to the season opener. I said I had already arranged a box with friends. You accepted it so quietly." His grip on her hand tightened, then deliberately relaxed. "I took her. The whole of London saw her in my box, wearing diamonds I had purchased from Rundell and Bridge, and you stayed home in the country with the curtains drawn." "I did not stay home," Elinor said. "I went to the village assembly. I danced with the blacksmith's apprentice and the vicar's son and every farmer who asked. I laughed more that night than I had in the entire previous year." Ashworth missed a step, recovered. "I did not know that." "You did not ask." The waltz was ending. The final strains of the music spiraled upward, and Ashworth stopped in the center of the floor, still holding her hand. "I am asking now," he said. "Tell me everything I missed, every moment I was not there. I will listen, I swear it." Elinor looked at him, at the lines etched around his eyes, at the sincerity that had cost him visible effort, and felt something long closed begin, very faintly, to open. It was not forgiveness. It was not love. It was the acknowledgement that a ruin could, under the right conditions, be excavated. "Perhaps," she said, "we might begin with a conversation, tomorrow, at Ashworth Hall." She withdrew her hand and walked back to where Ravenscroft waited, his expression inscrutable but his eyes warm. The ton dissolved into speculative whispers, and Lady Hartwell was heard to remark that she had never seen anything quite so thrilling in 40 years of hosting. The conversation at Ashworth Hall lasted 7 hours. It began in the blue parlor, where Elinor had once sat alone with her embroidery while her husband gallivanted through London, and it wound through the gardens, the library, the gallery of ancestral portraits. They did not shout. They did not weep, though Ashworth's voice broke twice and Elinor's hands went white-knuckled around a teacup that had been a wedding gift from his mother. They simply talked, excavating 6 years of silence layer by layer. He confessed to his affairs, not just Celeste Duval, but the others before her, stretching back to the first month of their marriage. He spoke of his father's example, the cold and predatory man who had taught him that wives were for heirs and mistresses were for pleasure. He described the moment in Ravenscroft's dining room when he had seen Elinor seated opposite another man, and realized, with a force that had nearly driven him to his knees, that she had become the center of his world precisely when he had forfeited any claim to her. Elinor listened. She did not offer absolution, but she offered something Ashworth had not received from anyone in his adult life, her full, unbroken attention. When he finished, she told him about the years of loneliness, the meals eaten alone, the letters she had written and never sent, The week she had nearly packed a bag and fled to a distant cousin in Scotland, stopped only by the thought of the scandal that would engulf her family. She told him about the night she had stood on the balcony of Ravenscroft Hall and realized she would rather live as a scandal than die as a shadow. At the end of the 7 hours they had reached no settlement, no dramatic reconciliation, but they had reached something rarer, the truth. "I cannot promise you I will return," Elinor said, as the autumn dusk painted the library windows amber. "I may never be able to live under this roof as your wife again." Ashworth nodded. "Then I will live alone under this roof, and I will work every day to become a man worthy of the honor you have already given me, whether or not you ever walk through that door. The separation will not be contested. I have already instructed my solicitor to draw up the final papers with the terms you requested. Ravenscroft's property, your dowry, your freedom, it is all yours." Elinor studied his face, searching for the performance, the hidden barb. She found only exhaustion and a quiet, unpolished sincerity. "Thank you," she said. "That must have cost you a great deal." "It cost me my pride," Ashworth said. "My pride was the least valuable thing I owned." While Ashworth and Elinor were rebuilding the foundation of a shattered marriage in the library of Ashworth Hall, the Duke of Ravenscroft was in London, attending to a matter of his own. He had summoned the editor of the Morning Chronicle to his private study, along with the most widely read publisher of scandal sheets. "You will print retractions," Ravenscroft said. "Every insinuation about the Duchess of Ashworth's character that has appeared in your pages over the past season. You will publish a full account of her husband's admitted infidelities and his public statement of contrition. You will make it clear that the Duchess has acted with nothing but dignity throughout." The editor, a man who had survived 2 libel suits and a duel, paled. "Your Grace, the public expects." "The public will expect whatever I tell them to expect." Ravenscroft's voice was soft as ash, and twice as suffocating. "You have printed lies about a woman I hold in the highest regard. I am offering you the opportunity to print the truth instead. If you decline, I will purchase both your enterprises and install editors who understand the value of accuracy." They did not decline. The next morning, London woke to headlines that reframed the entire affair. The Duchess of Ashworth was not a scorned woman clinging to another man for protection. She was a woman of remarkable fortitude, finally vindicated. The Duke of Ashworth's public admissions of fault were printed verbatim. The Duke of Ravenscroft was described as a family friend who had offered sanctuary during a difficult period. It was a masterclass in narrative control, and by midday, half the drawing rooms in Mayfair were toasting Elinor's name. Ravenscroft sent a single line to Elinor at Ashworth Hall. "The record is corrected. What you do with the future is entirely your own." Elinor read the note in the blue parlor with Ashworth across from her. She passed it to him without comment. He read it, and his jaw tightened, but he handed it back. "He is a better man than I am," Ashworth said. "He is a different man," Elinor replied, "and he has had fewer lessons in cruelty." "Will you go to him?" It was the question that had hung unspoken between them since the 7-hour conversation ended. Elinor folded the note and placed it in her reticule. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I need time to understand what I want, beyond simply escaping what I had. Ravenscroft deserves a woman who is whole, not one who is merely fleeing a wreckage." Ashworth absorbed this. Then he did something that surprised them both. He smiled. It was a thin, bruised smile, but it was real. "I never gave you time, did I? I pushed and demanded and took. If time is what you need, take it. Take years if necessary. I have already proven I can occupy an empty house. I can learn to occupy it with patience." Spring came to the countryside like a pardon. The frost receded from the lawns of Ashworth Hall, and the first green shoots pushed through the soil of the gardens Elinor had once tended alone. She divided her time between the dower house on the edge of Ravenscroft's estate and the blue parlor of Ashworth Hall, where she and Alexander met twice a week for tea, and the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding what had been destroyed. They were not lovers. They might never be again, but they became, over the course of those months, something that had eluded them throughout their marriage: friends. Alexander learned to ask about her day and listen to the answer. Alina learned to speak without measuring every word for its potential to be used against her. They discussed estate business, tenant welfare, the village school she was funding with a portion of her recovered dowry. They laughed cautiously at small things: a clumsy puppy in the stables, a letter from a cousin full of outrageous gossip. And once, when Alexander accompanied her to the village assembly and danced with the miller's widow, Alina watched from the refreshment table and felt not jealousy but a strange, quiet pride. The man on the dance floor, smiling awkwardly as he fumbled the steps, was not the man who had left her for a season of selfishness. He was becoming someone new, and she had helped midwife that transformation by refusing to accept the old version. In May, the Duke of Ravenscroft hosted a small gathering at his hall to mark the official opening of the new drainage system Alina had designed. It was attended by local landowners, a representative from the Agricultural Society, and, at Alina's invitation, Alexander Devereux, the Duke of Ashworth. The two dukes met on the terrace while Alina spoke with the engineer about sluice gates. For a long moment, they simply stood side by side, watching the woman who had, in her way, reshaped both their lives. "I owe you a debt," Ashworth said at last, "for her, for what you gave her when I gave nothing." Ravenscroft did not look at him. "You owe me nothing. What I offered freely. It required no repayment." "Nevertheless," Ashworth drew a breath, "I understand you loved her before I married her." A pause, then Ravenscroft inclined his head. "I saw her at a ball in her first season. She laughed at something a friend said, and the sound of it stayed with me for a decade. I told myself it was a youthful infatuation. I was wrong." "Do you love her still?" Ravenscroft finally turned, his flint-gray eyes meeting Ashworth. "I will love her until I am dust, but I will not press a claim. She has endured enough pressure from men who wanted to own her. She deserves to be chosen, not captured." Ashworth was silent. Then he extended his hand. Ravenscroft took it. The handshake lasted longer than custom required, and when they broke apart, something unspoken had been settled between them, a mutual recognition that the woman they both loved was the author of her own story, and they were merely characters grateful to appear in her pages. The wedding was announced in late summer, a brief notice in the Gazette that nevertheless consumed the ton for an entire season. The Duke of Ravenscroft was to marry the former Duchess of Ashworth, whose legal separation had been finalized in June under an unprecedented private act of Parliament that allowed her to retain her title and remarry. A legal innovation engineered entirely by Ravenscroft's parliamentary allies, and pushed through with a ruthlessness that reminded Westminster precisely why Dominic Hale was feared. Alexander did not contest the act. He voted for it himself, standing in the Lords to speak in favor of the woman he had wronged. The speech was short, unpolished, and so startlingly honest that several peers were seen dabbing their eyes. It was, the papers declared, the most remarkable political debut in a generation. Alexander declined all interview requests and returned to Ashworth Hall, where he was learning to make furniture in a workshop he had built behind the stables. The labor, he told Alina during one of their now weekly teas, gave his hands something to do while his mind learned patience. On the morning of the wedding, Alina stood in a room at Ravenscroft Hall that had been prepared for her, surrounded by flowers she had chosen herself. Her gown was not ivory. She had done that once before, with trembling hands and a heart full of false hope. This gown was deep rose, the color of a winter sunset, and she wore no veil. She was done with hiding. The ceremony was small, 24 guests, no trumpets, no parade. Ravenscroft waited at the altar, his severe features transformed by an expression of such open tenderness that several guests later swore he looked like an entirely different man. When Alina walked down the aisle, she did so alone, not because there was no one to give her away, but because she had decided that she was not property to be given. She was a woman arriving at her own future, under her own power, with clear eyes and a heart that had been broken and rebuilt and was now, impossibly, whole. She reached Ravenscroft. He took her hand. "You are certain," he murmured, and it was such a reversal of the expected question. She was certain. That Alina laughed softly, a sound that rippled through the chapel like birdsong. "I have never been more certain of anything," she said. "I choose this. I choose you, not because I need sanctuary, but because I want a partner. Then I will spend the remainder of my days endeavoring to be worthy of that choice," he said, and the vows they exchanged were not the standard words of the prayer book. They had written them together, a covenant of equals, and when the officiant pronounced them married, the applause was not polite, it was fierce, a roomful of witnesses who understood the weight of what had been overcome. The reception was held on the terrace overlooking the lake, and as the afternoon light turned golden, Alina found herself standing apart from the guests, looking out over the water. Alexander approached, a glass of champagne in each hand. He offered her one. "To your happiness," he said. She took the glass. "And to yours when it finds you." "I am working on that," he hesitated. "I meant what I said in the Lord's. Marrying you was the single best decision of my life. Treating you as I did was the worst. I will carry that contradiction forever." "Then let it make you kind," Alina said gently. "That is the only redemption that matters." He nodded, and after a moment he returned to the party, where he was soon engaged in conversation with a widowed viscountess who had a sharp wit and an interest in carpentry. Alina watched them with something that felt, unexpectedly, like hope, not for herself. For herself she had already found what she needed, but for the man who had once been her entire world and was now becoming a man she could genuinely wish well. A hand touched her elbow. Ravenscroft, her husband, stood beside her. "Are you ready to begin?" he asked. She turned to look at him, the most powerful duke in England, a man who could have had anyone, who had waited a decade for a woman who did not need him but chose him anyway. The future stretched before her, uncertain as all futures were, but no longer frightening. "I have already begun," she said. "This is merely the next chapter." He smiled, and together they walked back into the light and noise of the celebration. Two people who had found each other not by accident, but by the deliberate, hard-won act of refusing to settle for less than love.